Good afternoon and welcome to today's AIM Center webinar. It's about transition planning, and there's a subtitle that goes along with this, something about accessible materials and technologies inside of transition planning for post-secondary goals. I'm Cynthia Curry. I'm Director of Technical Assistance for the AIM Center at CAST, and in addition to my co-presenter, Richard Jackson, I'd like to thank Leslie O'Callaghan of the AIM Center and CAST, as well as today's CART provider, Cindy, for providing assistance today for us.
And I'm Richard Jackson. I've been associated with CAST since 1999 and been an ongoing staff member at the AIM Center. I'm primarily based on the faculty at Boston College. I've worked for many years in preparing special educators, primarily teachers of the blind and visually impaired. And today, I'm working with Cynthia, who is really the expert. So if there are any mistakes, we're going to blame Cynthia. Now, my role here is to bring some perspective as a consumer. I grew up with severe visual impairment. I now also have hearing impairment. So I am a print disabled person, and I've been using technology as it's developed most of my life, and also accessing digital materials to do my work. So I'll be sitting along here with Cynthia and hopefully adding some context. I'm happy to be here with Cynthia.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Glad to have you here. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was going to say, don't let Richard get away with comments like,
that's right.
Like he's not an expert. Make sure all the hard questions go to Richard in front of all of your questions. Okay. So Richard, would you answer this question? So information before we begin. This is all logistical. Audio is muted for everybody, or will be muted as people enter, and that's simply to prevent background noise. We definitely want to hear your comments, your questions, so please use the chat pod, the chat area for doing that. The webinar slides and a digital handout that accompany today's webinar are available for download at the event page, and Leslie has entered the link to that here in the chat. So there's both the PowerPoint presentation file as well as a digital handout that has the list of all of the resources that we'll be referring to today. So rather than feeling like you have to write a lot of things down, please know you have access to the PowerPoint as well as to all of our resources. The archive and a transcript for today's webinar will be posted on the event page within the next couple of days. And of course, at the end of the webinar, just a preview that we'll have a question asking you to complete our evaluation so that we can continue to improve and meet the needs of our stakeholders. So there we are, Cynthia and Richard and Cynthia. We've already kind of introduced ourselves. I will add to Richard's introduction about what we have to offer, what we bring to this webinar, as we want all of you to do the same. My background is in K-12 as a middle and high school science teacher. I also have taught pre-service and in-service teacher education, was a disability services coordinator for a small private university, and I have a smidgen of experience in adult ed as well. So we kind of pepper a lot of different areas, but really I think what we need is to make sure that everybody here contributes some ideas and experiences, because this obviously is a very complicated topic, transition with a lot of different perspectives and situations that we would love to have included throughout the webinar. So we're going to be talking today, a brief introduction to the AIM Center, our goals and our services. We'll define secondary transition and the challenges so that we are all starting from a similar context and understanding about transition. We will discuss some definitions and examples of accessible materials and technologies because that is the focus area that we have today on transition. We'll explore relevant legislation in both higher ed and workforce development. We'll look at some post-secondary accommodations, the process for doing that when students transition out of and exit high school, as well as student responsibilities, as well as some recommendations for preparing students to use their post-secondary AIM accommodations. So as you'll see across these bullets is that we're taking a two-pronged look at transition. We're looking at it from both the perspective of students who are going to be going into higher ed settings, so that would be colleges, universities, community colleges, technical colleges, as well as workforce development, which includes some of that formal education, but can also include areas, for example, of VR and job training centers. So a little bit about the AIM Center before we get started. Our goal is to build the capacity of wide range stakeholders from states and districts, post-secondary institutions, families, publishers, workforce development agencies, to increase the availability and the use of accessible materials and technologies. From our point of view, if we increase the demand for accessible materials and technologies, we'll have an increase in its use and therefore more successful learning outcomes once people have access to the curriculum, regardless of whether it is in early learning, K-12, higher ed, or workforce development. We want everyone to have access to and use materials and technologies that are accessible to them. Our services are primarily centered around technical assistance, providing tools and resources that are built on best practices and available to our multiple stakeholders. So on the screen is an image of essentially a funnel that shows the tiers of our technical assistance. So universal is really the broadest. Everyone has access to our website, to our listserv. We have requests for technical assistance that come in through telephone and email. We also have a newsletter. Our targeted technical assistance really comes by request from particular groups who need more targeted types of assistance, as well as our own gathering of needs from our stakeholders in the field. So for example, today's webinar on transition really is a targeted example of our technical assistance. And then finally, we work with 8 what we call the best practices cohort states, and these are states we work with to develop examples and models for other states to learn from. So we work with Alaska, Florida, Indiana, Iowa, Maryland, Minnesota, Ohio, and Texas as our best practices cohort, and we'll scale what we're learning from those states to others. So secondary transition, there's a guide that came out in January of this year, just a few months ago. This is an image of the cover of a transition guide to post-secondary education and employment for students and youth with disabilities. It was published by the U.S. Department of Education, and I post it here because I think it's a good resource that recently came out that some people may have missed. It includes real-life examples and a sample flow chart of the transition process, and there's also a glossary of key terms that are used in the transition process. I looked at it, and it was really helpful for adding some key ideas to our webinar today, particularly when it comes to the workforce development side of transition. So here's an image of a traffic sign pointing to learning in multiple directions, because transition means that there are changes ahead for students, but there are multiple pathways that lead to continued learning opportunities. So Richard, is there anything you want to add about the types of changes that you are aware of?
I think that the IEP, the history of the IEP is that it supports access to the general curriculum in K-12 schools, and it also provides support for learning disability-related skills and and tools and strategies to cope with disability. But life goes on, and students with disabilities need to transition into the adult world. And that's where the pathways start to split off into independent community living supports, sheltered employment, or supported employment, into career preparation, the world of work, into post-secondary education. A lot of choices, a lot of pathways to pursue, and it's important that we help our students get ready, their families make decisions.
Great, thank you, Richard. And please go ahead and enter your questions and comments in the chat as we go on, because we do want to make sure that although we only have an hour and counting today, we do appreciate and understand that there are multiple pathways for us to be pursuing today, and Richard and I have paved out a few, and we welcome you to add your experiences as well. The transition definition comes from, or the one that we're using today that we thought would be appropriate, is the federal definition, and it is it's one that describes transition as a coordinated set of activities for a child with a disability to plan for the transition to adulthood. And there is really a full, probably paragraph-long definition that's federally defined. But some key points that we pulled out from that definition is that transition is results-oriented, it's based on individual needs, and it includes instruction-related services, community experiences, employment, etc. So it's a very broad definition. The IEP team initiates this planning when developing the IEP that will be valid on a student's 16th birthday. That's federally, but for some states, that age is 14 years old. And of course, I think Richard and I would both advocate, as well as most people attending today with experience in transition, that the transition planning process begin really as early as possible. There are some things that can be done with students from very young ages to scaffold this process to prepare them for the ultimate exit from their K-12 experience.
And I think those of us in special education have always seen the need to prepare students to cope with a disability. But in reality, what we're preparing students for is for a rich and fulfilling life in the community. And that's why these pathways are important to become aware of and prepare students with decision-making and self-determination and involvement, college and career readiness.
So we have a poll I'm going to go ahead and open. This is about the challenges to post-secondary or secondary transition into post-secondary settings. This would be the workforce or higher ed. And our question before we go on and talk about some of the challenges that we're aware of is to ask you, what are the challenges you've seen before, during, and after the student transition process? This is a short answer question, and we're going to give you a few, not a few minutes. We're going to do a little bit of wait time here. We're going to give you probably about 20 seconds to go ahead and enter anything in this poll. The question being, what are the challenges you've seen before, during, and after the student transition process? So we're going to leave this poll up here for about 20 seconds. Both Richard and I are well-trained educators, so we are familiar with wait time.
The importance of pause.
We don't find it awkward. We see it as a strategy.
The research is really interesting on pause. The teacher presenting to a class feels that time is going by much quicker than it really is. Often we don't give enough time for pause. But in this virtual world, we're on the clock here.
That's right. Oh, so we've got one working with parents, absolutely. And I don't know if people can certainly be more specific about that. I know as a disability services coordinator in higher ed, working with parents was very challenging. Sometimes we think that it's the students that are experiencing a lot of anxiety during this transition period, and we overlook what their parents are going through. Entering into the workforce definitely has its unique challenges, motivating students to stay engaged, providing the right information to non-special education staff to better understand AEM and how to prepare students with disabilities for higher education, getting ready for work. Okay, so we need this person as our, within our webinar here. Oops, I just clicked on something that came up from Adobe Connect. Obtaining full-time employment, not accepting and dealing with the difference between K-12, IDEA, Section 504, ADA, student knowing what they want to do, some parents not understanding what their child can do, not doing real transition activities, okay, maybe not being intentional or purposeful, lack of job training programs, great examples, transportation. Boy, Richard, we have a lot of people coming in here.
Wow.
Motivating to stay engaged. I think I'm going back through support available for families for work sites or college, progress monitoring, implementation services stated in the IEP. All right, so I don't know what's left. We have some, go ahead and close that poll, but please use the chat to continue the conversation. We have some that you also captured. Of course, IDEA no longer applies. Students must now transition to new laws and new requirements. We'll talk a little bit about the implications of that. Advocacy shifts from the family and the educators to the student. So in K-12, students are typically accustomed to others looking out for them and making sure that they have what they need. Of course, if they're fortunate, they've had that. We know some students don't have skilled advocacy in K-12, but many have benefited from that, and they need to let that go and do that for themselves.
It's very interesting that as a university professor, we're not permitted to disclose information about our students to their parents. Their
Right.
parents call us and inquire about a grade or about our conversations with their children. They are no longer their children.
That's right.
They are their own agents. And that's something that has really come down through administration in higher ed, under FERPA provision,
Sure.
right to privacy.
So that transition to adulthood comes with privacy rights
Yes,
that both the families and the students need to adjust to. Of course, the heat gets turned up in both higher education and workforce development in terms of academic demands, which creates a lot of discomfort for everybody. And then the responsibility for requesting and using accommodations, including accessible materials and technologies, falls solely on the students. So let's look at what that accessible materials and technologies are, what they mean as accommodations at both the K-12, the higher ed, and the workforce settings. So let's put some context around what we mean by accessible materials and technologies. The functional definition of accessible, it's defined by the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education, and it means that a person with a disability is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. So the key terms there are same, obviously the word same appears repeatedly, equally effective, equally integrated, and substantially equivalent ease of use.
And I think that these are really important areas to think about because historically we've only been concerned with the problem of access. If we can get it to talk and get it on time, then that's access. But thinking about how one interacts with technology and how one interacts with materials, how does one take notes, how does one mark up materials, how does one convert materials into something that is a creative product for submission for a grade or a raise on the job. These are all kind of new considerations that are really important.
Yeah, really critical implications here. Another way to look at accessibility is to break it down into these four distinct terms: accessible material, accessible technology, and then of course assistive technology and assistive technology services. And these are important to make distinct so that we have a framework to work from. So accessible materials and technologies, I have a slide here that has these terms side by side. Accessible materials are make up the information or the content of the curriculum or the training. So examples of materials would be a website or an ebook or a video. Accessible technologies, on the other hand, are hardware or software that delivers that content. So examples of technologies would include a learning management system, a smartphone, a refreshable braille display would be considered a technology. So technology is a delivery system. Going back to the accessible materials, what makes them accessible is that they're designed or enhanced in a way that makes them usable by the widest possible range of learner variability, regardless of format. So for example, a standard print book would be converted into an accessible material if it's converted to a specialized format for a student with low vision, for example, or a student with a learning disability. Another example of an accessible material would be an ebook that is designed to be accessible and interoperable with assistive technology, or video with captioning and audio description would be an example of an accessible material. For technology to be accessible, it would be usable by people with a wide range of abilities and disabilities, and it's either directly usable without assistive technology or it can be made usable with it. And that's the interoperability that is important to making technology accessible.
Just think if you are able to store accessible content, documents, PDFs. I work a lot with accessible PDFs, and I can access these accessible PDFs from an Android smartphone or an iPad or my Windows machine or my Mac. And all of these source materials can be pulled down from anywhere, on the train, traveling, in the office, at home. They can all be pulled down across platform and across device simply because of their interoperability.
Great. Richard gave you a real authentic example right there. Yeah. Another one is on your screen. There's a cartoon image of a figure holding a tablet computer with a website on it. This is an example of accessibility if the content on that tablet is accessible. So for example, an accessible website read on a tablet computer designed with accessibility options. So if the author of the website followed web accessibility standards, that would be making the content accessible to a wide range of users. So that's the accessible material. The technology is the device that is delivering that website to the user. So if that tablet is made accessible by the developer by having built-in accessibility options, such as a built-in screen reader for somebody with low vision or blindness, text-to-speech for somebody with a reading disability, custom display features, closed captions on videos, and video description would all be examples of how the accessibility of the material and the technology would work together for a wide range of users and just be inherently accessible to more people.
You know, what we're seeing is a fabulous achievement in technology, is the blending of assistive technology with conventional technology with universal access features. We've made tremendous progress with that, and we're all reaping the benefits.
So Richard just made the segue to assistive technology, which I think a lot of people here, based on what we know your roles are familiar with these definitions. But assistive technology is both a device and a service. It's federally defined by the AP Act, in IDEA, in Section 508. but an AT device is any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially, modified, or customized, that is used to increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities of an individual with a disability. So some examples of that would be an electronic braille reader, switch access for people with physical disabilities who don't use traditional keyboards or standard mouses, voice recognition, etc. An AT service really needs to be integral to the device. It's any service that directly assists an individual with a disability in the selection, the acquisition, or the use of an AT device. So some examples of that would be an assessment of an individual's need for AT, trials of various technologies, and of course the training, not just for the user of the AT, but family, service providers, educators as well.
Loaner programs would be a good example. It doesn't work until it works for you. That's been my experience. That's an old adage in the AT world.
Right, accessible to whom?
That's right.
Accessibility is not one thing. So here's an example of interoperability, which is a key term to that definition of accessibility. And Richard was referring just a moment ago to standard commercial technology and how that can be made accessible and the advancements that have been made. On the screen is an example of this. It's an iPad that is, or a switch that's connected to an iPad. That switch is the iAdapter 5. It's from Augmentative Communication Consultants. And with that switch attached to the iPad, it makes that tablet accessible to people who cannot use the iPad using the gestures and the manipulations under which the device was originally designed. So there are some users who can't swipe the screen or tap, so that switch gives them an option or an alternative to the typical way that users interact with the device. So interoperability is key because if the device had not been built to be compatible with a switch, the device would not be usable by an individual with a physical disability that requires that access method.
I just discovered recently in my own learning that YouTube can be operated with switch controls using a commercially available device. The name of it escapes me. I apologize. Maybe you can follow up on this, but it's a center foot switch that starts and stops, starts and pauses and resumes the YouTube video, and it can left and a right foot paddle for $69. It lets you go backwards and forwards. So why would this be important? Well, I'm a guitar player, and I like to learn guitar riffs on YouTube. But I put my face very close to the screen, albeit a 28-inch screen, and it's hard for me to play my guitar and operate the YouTube at the same time. So I can now play my guitar and operate the YouTube presentation of the music lesson in real time without having to put my instrument down and manipulate the keyboard and pick my instrument up. So that's just a very personal example that I'm obviously over the top about.
Yeah, I think you just had many people over the top about that, and I think you're going to need to make a YouTube video of how that works.
I'll have to bring my guitar to the next webinar.
All right, so transition to higher education. We're going to explore what do we mean by higher ed and what are the relevant legislative statutes, mandates, provisions that are relevant to accessible materials and technologies. So in our context for this webinar, higher education refers to formal education at the community college and university settings. Online courses and credentialing entities is what we would be referring to as higher education, as well as career and technical education. So these are just examples of what we're considering to be higher ed as we talk about the transition to this particular setting of post-secondary. The relevant legislation in higher ed which are important for students to know and for specialists and parents and educators who are assisting them in the transition process. These are key because institutions of higher education do what they need to do as it's mandated. So legislation can be a roadmap to what's going to be most helpful and most effective for students to know and what to do when they are preparing for these settings.
And legislation really does set the bottom line, and institutions compare themselves against other institutions. Accessible websites, disability services policies, accessible syllabus for courses, and the availability of accessible textbooks. These are all fairly explicit in the legislation and required in universities these days.
So the two laws that are most specific to these considerations are the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehab Act. So ADA in higher ed is really the umbrella law. It prohibits discrimination, guarantees that people with disabilities have equal opportunities to participate in the mainstream of American life, and this includes both education and employment. Title II and Title III are the two titles of the ADA that relate to higher education. Title II being state and local government, so that would be your public colleges, community colleges, universities. Title III, public accommodations, would apply to your private universities and colleges. So this applies to programs and activities in these higher ed institutions, and the ADA is enforced by the Department of Justice for Titles II and Title III. Section 504 prohibits exclusion from participation in and benefits of programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. So this is most everybody in the higher education sector receives federal financial assistance in some manner. Federal financial assistance for students, grant funding comes in many different ways, and it's very unlikely that your private university or college that you're sending a student to or a student is interested in would not fall under Section 504 as a protection of their disability rights.
Absolutely, yeah.
Section 504 requires the provision of appropriate auxiliary aids and services in a timely manner, and that would include accessible materials and technology.
And you know, and increasingly as technology and digital curricula come into the regular curriculum in universities, it's important that disability services be coordinated through the academic side of the university, the provost office, for example, or at least to have close liaison with the academic side of the university. Instead of regarding disability services as a counseling or support service to emotionally help and care for students with disabilities. So what's most important for students with disabilities at universities is that they have access to a high quality education just as everybody else coming. And that turns out to be solidly an academic concern.
So let's transition to the workforce sector. What do we mean by workforce development, and what is relevant AIM legislation in that sector? Workforce development is a little bit more widely defined than higher education because workforce development training happens in a lot of settings. One is formal education, so similar to what we just discussed as higher education. So your community and technical colleges and universities provide workforce development training, as do online courses and credentialing entities and high school career and technology education. There are workforce development training opportunities when students are on the job. So this includes apprenticeships, internships, workplace training, as well as full employment. And this would be with supports or fully integrated training. And then your state and local workforce training programs, so these would include American Job Centers, state vocational rehabilitation programs, and adult basic education programs. American Job Centers are also known as one-stop career centers, if you're more familiar with that term. There are over 3,000 of those across the country, which makes workforce development quite a complex system to navigate. Richard, did you have something you wanted to add?
I did. I'm thinking with workforce, it's important not to just consider how people get connected with employment, but also how they adjust to employment and are supported on the job, and also importantly, how they have equal opportunity to advance on the job. So I think it's the advancement that often gets overlooked, and that's where disability discrimination. Once employers feel that they've done their goodwill by employing a person with a disability, doesn't mean that their obligation ends then to provide equal opportunity to contribute to the growth of the organization and advance within that organization.
Great, and of course that's part of the legislation that protects these folks and provides a roadmap. So a couple of the examples to support Richard's comments is legislation that falls under state and local training programs. So that would be the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, most specifically Section 188. And then on the job, the laws that apply are the ADA, but this time Title I as opposed to Titles II and III for higher ed, and Section 503 of the Rehab Act. So let's look at WIOA. As we mentioned earlier, there are over 3,000 one-stop career centers or American Job Centers. So the WIOA brings together in strategic coordination those core programs of the federal investment that's put into skill development. It became law on July 22nd of 2014, so this is relatively new. WIOA replaces the Workforce Investment Act, and that is lost. It was the Workforce Investment Act of 1998. So the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act replaces that. And all states were required to submit a WIOA state plan by April 16th of 2016. And there is a link in the digital handout for this webinar that takes you to the website where you can actually look up your state's WIOA plan, which would be important for your students. If you have students who are transitioning to the workforce, that would be a great assignment for them, is to find their state's plan, to learn about what is in that, what their state is covering, and where they're putting their WIOA investment. And WIOA is jointly enforced by the Department of Labor and the Department of Education. Section 188 is really the specific place in WIOA that applies to accessible educational materials, and that was just, the final rule just came out in December of 2016, so it too is just a few months old. It's the part of WIOA that prohibits discrimination against people who apply to participate in, work for, or come into contact with programs and activities of the workforce development system. And people with disabilities fall into the multiple categories of protection. Programs and activities are subject to accessible materials and technologies. And the final rule that was just revised and published in December, it updates the term auxiliary aids or services to include new technologies, because this is an update to a 1999 provision, so they needed to look at some of those technologies that are now really outdated, and accessible electronic information and technologies are included in that updated definition. Of course, vocational rehabilitation has a key role under WIOA. State VR agencies are to set aside at least 15% of their funding, put that toward transition services for youth with disabilities. It's important for IEP teams to know that. And VR state grant programs are going to be required to engage employers to improve outcomes. And these are...
I would just comment, this is a fabulous provision to target percentages of total rehab funding in each state for this transition age youth, because it can provide for agreements between K-12 and post-secondary. For example, some traditional schools for the blind are proposing programs to fill a gap year for students that aren't quite, they graduated from high school, but they're not quite ready to begin a college career. And schools can fulfill a vital role during this period to ensure the success of students once they enter college.
And that coupled with the requirements under WIOA really strengthen the case
for that targeted population.
Right, yeah. and bring VR to the transition planning process. Some of this emphasis on pre-employment transition services stems from research that show that local workforce agencies cited significant barriers to obtaining accessible materials and technologies, as well as fulfilling their program accessibility requirements. So that was that research was one of the reasons that an increased emphasis on these training opportunities for transition of youth were included under WIOA in VR.
We have a lot of initials today, don't we?
We do. We do. Remember the transition handbook that I introduced at the very beginning? There's a glossary in there, which is very, very helpful.
That's good. It should be in the front of it.
Should be. I should update the digital handout and re-upload it to the event page as well. We can send out with the recording of today's webinar a list of the acronyms and abbreviations. So ADA also applies under workforce development. It's a different title though. Remember, Titles 2 and 3 apply to higher education. Title 1 is employment, and this is enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This is important to know because Title 1 covers a lot of different areas of employment. So under the job application procedures, students are covered. So if they need an alternative format of an application, that would be required under Title I if they need it in digital text or they need it in Braille or enlarged print. It covers hiring, firing, advancement, and as Richard has alluded multiple times, in order for students with disabilities to be provided with an equal opportunity to advance, they will need accessible materials and technologies to compete. For equal compensation and equal opportunity to receive raises, of course their job training, and any other terms, conditions, and privileges that aren't listed here but may arise in somebody's experience in the workplace. Section 503 also applies to the workforce. This is specific to federal contractors and subcontractors, so if there are students who are looking for employment in that sector, they are protected under Section 503. This requires federal contractors and subcontractors to take affirmative action to recruit, employ, train, and promote qualified individuals with disabilities. And new regulations under Section 503 establish a nationwide 7% utilization goal for qualified individuals with disabilities, which obviously is connected to the expectation that these contractors take affirmative action. So let's look at some of these accommodations because this is kind of where we're coming to. We've had a really quiet chat over here. Please remember, don't hesitate to enter your questions and comments in the chat pod. We welcome hearing from you. So we're looking at post-secondary accommodations, specifically the process, the students' responsibilities, and some AIM-related examples. So we have another poll here. I'm going to ask this time, our question is, what are your recommendations for preparing students for higher ed, the workforce, or other independent living opportunities? Because these recommendations really fall back into what are the types of accommodations that students might need. So we're going to do our wait period again, our wait time strategy. We're going to follow that research that Richard cited, that it seems longer for us than it does for you. Self-advocacy skills. So teaching students to prepare.
That's a really interesting one, self-advocacy. It is particularly students with learning disabilities where their disability is not so obvious, may be reluctant to disclose their need for accommodations with professors. They may be documented at the university, but they don't willingly or eagerly engage in conversations that could help them strike a working relationship with a professor. And I think this is unfortunate. I mean, they have gotten to university, they know they are successful, and they may continue to withhold disclosure when it really could work in their benefit. So I think we have a ways, to sum that up, I think we have a ways to go with our self-advocacy training with our students.
A lot of recommendations to start early, opportunities to learn reading and writing software that's used in college. Richard and I were talking about that as we were preparing to come on onto the webinar today. Teaching students how to use communication devices to advocate for themselves, learning social skills, and to ask for help. Take advantage of opportunities through IEP transition activities, higher ed mentors, early disclosure, work with rehab as early as possible, bringing in your VR support, because those people can continue.
Great recommendation.
Yeah, so beyond sort of that trapeze period where a student is kind of between exit and entry into their new setting, that VR person can be a key support. How to better increase school districts and local VR offices building relationships. Here's an acronym for us, DISPRO.
DISPRO, is that D-I-S-P-R-O?
That's it. All right, so here's one that I'll need to add to the digital handout. I think it also was mentioned in the chat as well. Somebody would go ahead and put that, spell that acronym out for us in the chat. That would be great. All right, so starting early, branching out, bringing in more people, teaching students to self-advocate and include their technology and their devices as part of that. So here are some things that some of them duplicate your recommendations, and some other things to think about. It's important for students to know that some of their IEP accommodations may be considered but not necessarily accepted, whether they're going on to higher education or in the workforce. They should definitely have their IEP as documentation that they received accommodations, but it in of itself may not be considered sufficient for them to receive the accommodations that they're requesting. The institution, the agency, or the employer is going to consider what are known as reasonable accommodations that don't fundamentally alter the requirements of a program or the functions of a job. So it's more about equal access than it is to success. So IDEA really is about advancement and making progress, whereas accommodations in post-secondary environments are really about providing equal access, fundamentally altering the requirements of a program or the functions of a job. Those would be something that might be considered. That would be students who are in a program that has to do with the health field, and they may have extended time as an accommodation for tests, for example, but that extended time may not apply to a series of skills that they need to demonstrate in a limited amount of time to show that they can execute the functions of their job. If a patient comes into the emergency room and they only have a certain amount of time to perhaps read a report or to conduct a series of tests, if that's a technical requirement of the program or the job, extended time may not be reasonable.
Very good
for
point.
that.
That's not a reasonable. It's also important to consider. Remember that special education, K-12, is specially designed instruction. Post-school, there's no longer specially designed instruction that's provided by the employer or the university. So it kind of switches to accommodations. So that builds the argument that, if a student is going to need a screen reader, they really should be using the screen reader in school. And when they transition to the workplace or the university, part of their skill set is the use of the screen reader, that the screen reader then goes with them. That's how they function at their best. That's why they're being selected for college. That's why they're being hired for employment.
So in order for those things, for disability support people in any setting post high school, documentation beyond the IEP and the summary of performance really is recommended to make sure that students receive what they need.
So important.
Student post-secondary responsibilities is that they're going to have to provide notice of their disability. So this would be for in higher ed, that would be a campus disability services office, and that's on-site or online. Make sure if you have students who are going into online programs that they know that they will be eligible to receive accommodations through that institution, or the job training center. There may be an ADA or a 504 coordinator, or if it's an employer, the HR office typically receives the request for accommodations. They're going to need to interact with the appropriate personnel in the identification of their accommodations. They're going to need to implement those accommodations independently, and they'll need to communicate with the appropriate personnel on the effectiveness of the accommodations. So really teaching kids that just because they've received certain accommodations doesn't mean that that's the end of the process. If they are experiencing some barriers or the accommodation is not working for them appropriately, then they need to advocate and communicate with the disability services personnel in any setting, letting them know that they need a change. Some AIM-related accommodations, so specific to accessible materials and technologies, would be alternative formats of printed textbooks and anything that's in an inaccessible format, including inaccessible digital textbooks. Use of assistive technology, so this might be text-to-speech technology, speech-to-text, reading pens, screen readers, use of a computer for exams. Those would all be related to accessible materials. Extended time on exams would be related to AIM because students who use text-to-speech or other technologies may need additional time. Note-taking services for lectures, audio recording of lectures, these are all typical accommodations for post-secondary environments. Not necessarily would be automatically provided to a student, but they are typical traditional types of accommodations that are considered.
Very typical and are based on traditional approaches in higher education. The professor who's the sage on the stage giving lectures. But today with digital technologies and digital content, there's a lot of flexibility in course delivery where some of these, like the note taker and some of these traditional accommodations are no longer necessary.
Okay, so let's go look at some of these, some recommendations. Some of these were already mentioned during the poll. And Claudia, we see that you have a question. We're going to get to that in just a moment, but about 504 plans. So one recommendation is to give students a record of their use of accessible educational materials and technologies. So in the IEP, make clear the connection between their need for AIM and other areas. So what's the connection between their need for AIM and their functional performance, on their academic achievement, their annual goals, placing AIM in supplementary aids and services, and in their post-secondary goals in transition services are all strategies. The more you can make the case for the student's need and the record that they used it, the better, making the stronger case. And in the summary of performance, AIM could be placed in the summary of functional performance as well as in the recommendations. This could also, of course, be placed within a 504 plan to address Claudia's question. And Claudia also asked if colleges, universities acknowledge 504 plans that are presented by a student with a disability. They will acknowledge the 504 plan, but it may not be sufficient in and of itself to determine reasonable accommodations. The disability services personnel would likely ask for additional accommodations, but there have been changes with the amendments to the ADA of 2008. There were some changes in the extent to which disability services providers can require extensive amounts of documentation. So it really depends on the individuals that you are that you're working with and their expectations for documentation that's required. So a really helpful resource for where AIM is placed in the IEP is a recent webinar of the AIM Center, and it is archived. It's AIM in the IEP, where do accessible materials and technologies fit? Joy Zabala and Diana Carl presented this webinar just a couple of weeks ago, and there's a link to this archived webinar in the digital handout, so be sure to download that. Teach students how to explain their own documentation, so if they have neuropsych or psychoeducational evaluation reports, if they have medical records that indicate their need for AIM, make sure that they not only have copies of that documentation, but they understand it and that they can explain it. They can connect the results of those exams to their need for accessible materials and technologies. And as we have talked earlier, multiple times, involve VR as a partner early and as necessary to support students in that process. Provide lots of opportunities to use AIM. Give students materials in alternative formats, multiple formats, across purposes, across content areas, in multiple settings, across devices. So have them try to use their accessible materials on an iPad, on a computer, on a smartphone, so that they are accustomed to using technology in multiple settings with multiple devices and various sources. So Bookshare and Learning Ally would be sources, but things like Audible, Amazon, places where they can download commercial products as well. Teach self-determination. We've seen this multiple times. Make sure students are included in their own transition process. Have them independently access and use accessible materials, and make sure that they are able to articulate their need for AIM. Lastly, buying accessible is one way that we can circumvent a lot of the need for accommodations for students. In the higher education and workforce settings, institutions, agencies are leaning more and more toward the need to purchase materials and technologies that are already accessible. They're doing this because of complaints that can be filed against them by individuals with disabilities, particularly students and advocacy organizations. K-12 schools and districts and state education agencies can also be doing this. There are resources through the AIM Center. The PALM initiative is one, purchase or procure accessible learning materials. That's in your digital handout. And the AIM Center has quality indicators that provide a guide toward identifying and purchasing materials and technologies that are already accessible. And of course, an important recommendation is connect with us at the AEM Center. You can email us at aim@cas.org. You can call us, or you can join us on Facebook and Twitter. And those ways to connect with us are also in the digital handout. And Leslie has entered that in the chat pod as well. Thanks, Leslie. So here's a question. I realized it's 3:01. We'll take a couple of questions and wrap up. Paula, question about the technology used in K-12, but often that technology does not move with the student. Any ideas on how to support students when the technology does not move with them to higher ed or workforce?
I think there's a strong argument that the technology must move with them. I think perhaps you mean the ownership of the technology. So if the school district owns the technology, then it becomes part of the transitioning agency to facilitate the purchase in collaboration with the university or the employer to continue with the technology. But the technology is what has defined the students' assets, what they bring, what strengths they bring as they transition. And it doesn't make any sense to go forward without that technology. That just bolsters the argument that students need to be proficient with their tools before they leave school. That they bring the argument forward that the tools are necessary to continue with success. So I don't think legally you can hang on to the technology that the school system has purchased, but
I think your voc rehab counselor will be helpful with that.
Kind of obligated to follow through with that. They certainly do in Massachusetts and Maryland and many states that I'm acquainted with.
We're going to go ahead and move on to the evaluation. We see it's 3:02, and we thank everybody for hanging in with us. There's a link to today's evaluation that I'm going to bring on over into the presenter area. You should see it here on the screen. Richard's heading out. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
You should, to be able to see the evaluation, the web link pod in the center of the screen, when you click on evaluation for today's webinar, there should be a button that pops up that says Browse To, and you can follow the link that way. Also, when we close out today's webinar, you'll be taken directly to the evaluation link. It's 3:03. I'm going to stay on for another moment to see if there are any questions. And I thank you all for attending today's webinar. Please contact the AIM Center with additional questions, suggestions, and of course enter those into today's evaluation. Thank you.